I've been involved with the STAIR project for a few years now. The idea originally started with Quo and actually builds on some research that I believe Tanu did when you were at Johns Hopkins as well, getting back into the indexing of astronomical observations. So today I'm going to go into some detail about just what the spatial temporal adaptive resolution encoding, or STAIR, is all about and how it's used. First, I'll go over some of the basics, and basics are pretty well represented by this presentation that was given earlier in the summer. And then after that, I'm going to switch over to a Jupyter notebook, which is running on a NASA managed cloud. So this particular talk was talking about an idea for using STAIR to discretize data, but I want to move straight into talking about the basics of what STAIR is all about. The underlying problem that we have in Earth science is that we have a lot of data. We're generating data all of the time, and it's not just one kind of data. When you have a spacecraft flying over the Earth, the data just doesn't naturally come out as a nice latitude longitude grid. The different kinds of data have different properties. So for the Earth science community, there's a general and broad distinction between different classes of data, where you have grid data, that's a regular spacing on the planet in some way, swath data, which is related to, for example, the spacecraft flying over and then looking down and gathering data as it flies overhead, and then point data. And we have that sort of demonstrated in this cartoon over here. And one thing I'd like to bring your attention to is that when you have these index values, L and M, I, J, and K, that's referring to a native indexing in the memory store where the data resides or is archived. And there is no real connection between those native data indices between different data products, even for data products within the same mission or with the same instrument. So this makes it very difficult to combine these data, and most people just wait for somebody to map the data onto a nice, easy to use grid. However, that involves processing the data and actually removing important information from the data. So a big problem comes in. You say, so I talked about variety there, but you also deal with scalability. And for scalability, you would like to be able to parallelize this data. You want to partition the data and then spread it out across a number of storage resources or computing resources. And so, for example, most analyses that we do in Earth or other kinds of science is that you come up with a region of interest that is of scientific interest to you, and you want to gather some data into that region of interest for your analysis. And so here we have pictured two different swaths that were taken perhaps by the same spacecraft or different spacecraft. They could be quite different spacecraft with different resolutions and different characteristics. But it's very difficult to go from these native array indices, the IJ and the QP over here, that actually index the data in the way that it's stored in the archive, and distribute that across those computing resources. And so just a natural native array based partitioning of the data might lead to moving the data to different computing resources according to the numbering scheme here. So you put this block on CPU 1, that block on CPU 3, and so forth. There's no real mapping between these two if you're stuck in the native data space, native index space, if you will. And so that's a big problem. And that's one of the main things that we want to address with the STAIR encoding, is how do you bring these guys together in a uniform framework so that you can harmonize these different kinds of data. So that would help us to be able to scale in both variety and volume. STAIR has both a spatial component and a temporal component. And just to give you a flavor of it, if you've seen the digital grid systems and things of that nature, this is our spatial encoding is based on the old hierarchical triangular mesh. It's a recursive partitioning of a root polyhedron that has the edges projected up onto the sphere. And then we label these and number these and actually build up an index based on where you are in this quad tree that is put onto the surface of the planet. So for example, this triangle here would have an index of 0 actually, and then we would subdivide it, and you can see that first subdivision in the 4 triangles over here, and then you just keep on doing that through the different refinement levels. And once you go through the different refinement levels and you have an ordered way of labeling the sub-triangles as you go along, you actually build up your index. And you see some of that over here on the right. And all of that maps back over into this tree structure that I mentioned that you're putting onto the planet. So by doing it this way, by building up your index from left to right, that allows you to number all of these different triangles that you have on the Earth. And an interesting thing is that all of these different triangles at all of these different levels that are on the planet, they all inhabit the same index space. So we've come up with a uniform way to index areas on the planet. And by looking at the numbers about the index values for a particular triangle on the surface of the planet, I can tell you whether or not they're part of the same leaf. So I can tell you pretty quickly, just by looking at the bit pattern, whether one triangle is in another triangle. And that helps us out when we're doing our geometric logic. We don't have to go back and touch floating point arithmetic and geometric calculations for that part. So the temporal part is similar, but instead of subdividing regions of space, you're actually subdividing according to calendar partitions. That's a less developed part of the code right now, but the spatial part is actually working rather well. So once you have this way of numbering the trixels, these triangular elements on the planet, you can start to do some interesting things. One thing I didn't mention before is that every trixel has both position information and resolution information. So we keep information about where you are all the way down to the leaf of the tree, and the triangular leaves of our tree are about 8 centimeters across. So we keep that information, but we also reserve, part of the 64 bits that we have to contain information about where you are in the level, about where you are, at what level you are in the tree. And so that way we have both a very highly precise, accurate position in each one of these numbers that we come up with, but we also have a broader area so that we can associate a neighborhood or a resolution with our stair index values. Excuse me.
So Mike, just to stop you over here, when you say resolution, is that the same as the level that you are mentioning in your previous slide? That is
correct. Mm-hmm. This is a rough way of associating an area with a particular index value. Mm-hmm. So if I give you one of our spatial stair index numbers, I can take a look at it and tell you what level is associated with that, and that gives me an area. But I can also go in there and tell you what specific point at the leaf level, to an 8 centimeters of precision, I can tell you where that location is too.
But
so I have both of those things. Go ahead.
Sorry, so the actual data may not be exactly at that resolution, but that's the closest resolution to which you have mapped it to. Is that right?
That is correct. That is correct. If you're doing better than 8 centimeters, then this particular version of the scheme wouldn't necessarily work for that. You'd have to, you could apply a similar stair-based scheme to that problem, but for what we're doing, our focus is on remote sensing of spacecraft data, and 8 centimeters is more than appropriate for registering and searching and intersecting that kind of data.
I actually have one more question at this point, which is that when you say that you store latitude and longitude along with this essentially bit encoding,
Yes.
you are not you're just storing latitude and longitude, but not the measurement value that would be there. Like for instance, I'm measuring pressure over there. Would you also be storing that? No.
No, what we have here is a map of the geolocation to a 64-bit integer.
Okay.
So you can map between latitude and longitude and this representation. So one way to think of this is that, let's see, I want my system to go forward. I think I've lost control here for a second. There we go. So one way to think of this is that we're simply a different way to represent the geolocation.
Sure.
So if you have it in latitude and longitude, this is actually the way it's represented in terms of bits. And so, for example, most of the data that we work with at NASA is actually in single precision floating point for these sorts of geolocations. And for this particular longitude latitude pair, you actually have these representation in bits. If you take these 64 bits and then convert them over into a stair index by doing the recursive geometric calculations that we currently do, you wind up with this set of bits. And this particular bits over here refers to, I believe this one refers to the quadrication level of 20. So this is down to a 10 meter resolution. So, but getting back to your point, the location is stored in bits all the way down to the leaf node of the tree, and the area node this one is down to level 20. So it's like I have this point I'm in, and I'm dealing with the triangle that is about 10 meters across, enclosing that particular point. So does that help?
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
Okay, very good. So one of the neat things that you can do when you have both geolocation information in there and this notion of neighborhood or resolution is that your index can actually adapt to the data that you have represented there. So for example, this is a MODIS swath. The spacecraft is moving in, down the center of this path over here, and it is the instrument is actually scanning from one side to the other. And when the look angle is bad, it's looking over towards the edge of the planet off to the side, the measurements are acquired at a greater distance apart from each other than when the spacecraft is looking straight down at nadir. And you can see that when we calculate the stair indices for these observation positions, we can very naturally adapt those stair index values to give us an idea about what the intrinsic resolution of the data set is. And so that's useful when we're trying to figure out whether two data sets overlap or not. Now there's a temporal part as well. I just took a forecast from Hurricane Irma, so very, very basic ideas, and converted those into a spatiotemporal set of stair index points, and gave you a display of what they look like here. So the large pastel colored blocks, that's the hurricane forecast going into the future. Key West doesn't really move all that much, so that's this particular set of stair indices going up this way. And then for fun, I had something that a notional airplane or something circling around Key West, and that's this space-time trajectory that you see over here. Now, once you have this ordered way of organizing your locations, this doesn't really care what your native array format is all about. So you can actually convert your native array indices with their geolocations into stair, and that will help you to co-align the different data points that you have into, say, different bins or chunks. And in this particular situation, we see the stair triangular indexing color-coded. And the idea is that at this particular level, we have each of these different colors corresponding to a different storage or computing resource, with the idea that if I have some data like this swath, with this swath of spacecraft data coming down here, it gets scattered into these different chunks with the different colors, and so I get a natural load balancing, and anything that shows any other kind of data that I have, for example, El Nino coming across this, I can figure out what its stare indices are, and when I map it to the computing resources, they'll fall into the same bin. And so this is basically one of the ways that we can actually use stare to organize and scale up in volume, while at the same time harmonizing different varieties. Here is an actual example. In this particular sketch, I used GOES geostationary spacecraft imagery data and MODIS with data, used stare to harmonize and combine those. The MODIS, this is a MODIS granule. It's a 5 minutes worth of MODIS data, and it's stored as a file on the NASA archives. And the GOES data, this is the footprint of the GOES data. And remember, GOES is sitting out at geostationary. It's taking an image of the entire Earth. And here I'm just looking at the part that's north of the equator. And I've done the stare indexing for the GOES data at a particular resolution, overlaid that with the MODIS data, and then did an intersection I have a nice little ROI, region of interest. And each one of these triangles that you see in here, all those triangles are just numbers. They're telling you where you are in the tree and give you an idea about the particular size associated with that particular index value. And on the middle, we see what happens when we take our region of interest, a set of stare indices, and then intersect that with the data sets that I represented over here. And you can combine those data, you can put them into the same trixel, and then color and display the trixels. And that's what's going on here. The blue data that you see on the right over here, that's the MODIS granule. And the brown data, that is the information from the GOES spacecraft. And then we've down selected it and visualized it over here. You actually see the little triangles showing up in this particular representation as well, because I actually used the stare indices in this example as an analysis tool. So I did my analyses on the triangles. And what I essentially did is that I took triangles that are a little bit larger than I needed to, and then I did an average to collect the data together. And then I set the colors of this according to the data from the two sets. And so this is actually an integrated data product using stare. And just to remind ourselves that if I put these different trixels over here onto different computing resources, I get scale up and parallelization. Now, this part is a proposal, and it just goes into an idea of what you can do with this with stare and stare indexing. The hierarchical data format's widely used in science and earth science to store data. They have this virtual data set that allows you to provide a front end that presents the data to an end user in a certain way, but then it points to other data resources, other HDF files in the back. So the idea that we were talking to NASA about, and it didn't get funded in this round, is that, well, we could take our stare indexing and thinking back to how we can partition or shard the data into our triangles, we can shard the data, break up earth science data according to stare, and then link it back together using the virtual dataset API of HDF. And in that way, we could actually present something that looks like a granule, and people would be able to load it like a granule into their regular software. But on the back end, it's actually divided up into these highly efficient storage mechanisms so that you can scale this out on cloud. And so you have the best of both worlds over here. You can use the way that you've always used it, but then you can also use the data harmonization that I talked about earlier. So for example, in the old way, when you're just dealing with granules, you would have swath A, swath B, and then you would have to do a lot of work to bring those together. But with using the stair shards idea, these different data resources are already lined up on the back end, and you just talk to your granule without even essentially caring what's going on in the back end, but you still get the parallel speed up and scale out. So there's architecture stuff here that we can talk about and how to find things. What I'd like to do now with the next section of the discussion would be to go over to the NASA cloud, the science managed cloud environment, and just leaf through some of the more recent calculations that actually show stair in use and show how easy it is to use. But before I begin, are there any questions at this point that I might be able to entertain?
Yeah, I have a really small one. This is really early on in the presentation. You said as part of the raw processing of this data, you actually lose some data and are kind of forced to pre-process it a little bit. Can you go into detail, like how the pre-processing works?
If that is what that is called. NASA has a systems architecture for how data is processed, because when it's taken on the spacecraft, it looks completely different from what you want it to look like to actually do your science. And so those are called different processing levels. Level 0 is the data as it comes down from the spacecraft, and that's practically unusable. Level 1, you have actually started to turn the spacecraft information into things that are lined up on the planet's surface, for example. So you start to add geolocation and registry information. So that process goes on in level 1 and level 2. There's slight differences depending upon what mission that you go in, but the main point about level 2 is that you start to have derived data projects and calibrations that are occurred that are at a slightly more processed level. But the important point is that when you're at level 1 and level 2, you're still at the point where you're talking about point observations and the swath. Okay, so you still have that level of information. Now, when you go to level 3, you want to take that pre-processed information, which is still useful, and it's on a usable geolocation registry and things of that nature. But everyone is going to be different. So this swath is going to be different from that swath. This mission is going to be different from that mission usually, and that's just what happens at level 1 and 2. So it's very difficult to use. To get it into level 3, you have to go through a process which is known as regridding, and that is essentially a process of interpolation, or smoothing, or kriging, depending upon what you're actually doing. But most of the time, when you go to level 3, what you're doing is that you're taking this oddly shaped swath and then projecting that down onto the grid somehow, so that you go from this thing which has a very irregular pattern, and then putting it into something that's more regular pattern with well-known and understood latitude, longitude separations, or if it's a different kind of grid. You can have different kinds of grids, but the level 3 products have standard grids that you've actually regridded, interpolated, and smoothed data onto these different points. So when you do that, you lose information about the look angles that you took the information from. You're combining data from different perspectives. So if you have a number if you have a particular grid that you're trying to get at, you might have different spacecraft observations from slightly different times, or actually very large difference of time, because some of these level 3 products cover a month's worth of data. You could have observations from several different days, from several different look angles, looking down at that same point and averaging those together, and then constructing your value associated, your data value, or a smoothed or processed data value, and assign that to the particular grid point. So you've changed the data. One of my colleagues, Quo San Quo, he likes to say that we've molested the data. Now it's never the same after that. So that's what's going on when you go from the lower level data, where you still have the maximum resolution available to you, have the maximum amount of physical information is still associated with the observations. But then when you start to when you process it more and put everything onto the same grid, you lose track of that. And so that's what's going on, you know, with regridding. Is that helpful?
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. Is there common practices, like are those techniques pretty standardized at this point, because those aren't really project exclusive?
Well, yes, what happens is that the community that is interested in a particular variable will get together and come up with something that squares the circle. So it's sort of what the group of people think they can best use. And it becomes a convention. And we'd like to break out of that convention somehow, because when you lose some of that physical information, you're sort of stuck with what other people have decided. So it makes it harder to answer some questions when you only have level 3 data to work with. And there's some things, for example, snow cover measurement and snow depth measurement, where once you go to the level 3 products, you simply can't do the retrievals. So if you can get around this problem of combining and harmonizing these different kinds of data together, you actually enable entire classes of scientific analyses. Okay. Thank you for the question. It's actually, there are standard techniques, and people come up with conventions to use those techniques. And if you go to the NASA Data Archiving and Analysis Centers, Acquisition and Archiving Centers, they're called DACs, you can get the level 3 products and they're standard products that everybody uses. So they are used a great deal. And we can actually get into that a little bit. This is actually a live Jupyter notebook, which is running on the Science Managed Cloud environment. This is a cloud environment that has just been set up over the past few weeks, and we're very privileged to be early users of this system. So I'm very grateful to the NASA Center for Climate Simulations to let us work through the bugs and kinks of the system and see how we can actually apply some of these STAIR ideas in the cloud. So this is actually running on Amazon servers, but managed by NASA. The standard. I also keep this code on the GitHub, so you can go to GitHub, spatiotemporal.org, and you can, for example, spatiotemporal, GitHub spatiotemporal, and this is where we actually keep a copy of this.
Mike,
yes?
Is it possible for people to actually see it on their computers? Like, would you mind sharing the link on a chat window, or?
Sure. That is a good idea. So you should be able to see this. And you can consider this a preprint. There's going to be a meeting. This is the ACM SIG spatial that is going to be held in a couple of weeks. So I talked about the grids. This is actually a fairly detailed tutorial that I'm paging through in this notebook, and it takes us from the basic of STAIR geolocation for the spatial component, and just goes over many of the same things that we've already talked about, except that it's actually showing how to use the STAIR libraries to generate some of these ideas. If you recall, I mentioned that there's both area or resolution information and position information. That's what you see here. If you take a look up at the top, this is the spatial ID from STAIR, just a bunch of bits. The geolocation part is here, and the resolution part is over here. And this is a level 3, which is about 1,000 kilometers across. And this particular STAIR ID is associated with Mauna Kea. So we have the leaf position of represented there by the red dot, and we have this area notion built in as well. I talked a lot about gridding, this is perhaps the queen or the empress, if you will, of that sort of grid data that we're talking about. This is actually a reanalysis product, which means that there's been a lot of work put into this. This is a combination of spacecraft data and simulation estimates interpolated and put onto a nice regular latitude longitude grid for people to use. So this data set is made to be the best estimate of, in this case, water data over perhaps 30 or 40 years. So this is one of the go-to products that NASA has. One of the problems, though, is that with using the data in this particular representation is that there's 400 points in this grid that are all the same physical location. And that's the polar degeneracy that you're talking about. In that sense, stare is a much more natural way to deal with locations, because you see up at the pole there's only one triangle, although the triangle is spread out because of the odd projection that we have. Now, one thing to realize is that you don't necessarily need to know the bits and do bit surgery on the system. You can actually deal with it through a higher level database. I mentioned the granules before, and so these are just a set of MODIS granules from NASA, and each one of these little triangles over here is a stare index value. So each one of these is just a small set of numbers, you know, just depending upon how carefully I want to represent the edges. But in this situation, I can use this to index and do my set logic and find out what intersects what. Now, one thing, this is another way to, if I crack open a granule and take a look at the data inside, this is the coast of Australia. This demonstration is just repeating the point that the indexing actually adapts to the change in the resolution across. So the spacecraft is coming down the center, it looks off to the side, and the resolution gets poorer down the wings of the swath. And if we concentrate our attention on the upper left-hand corner, we get this, and you see the variation of the stare indices across that section of data. Coarser triangles over here, finer ones over here. And this is all active, although you do have to load our system. Now, getting back to the point that I said you don't need to know about the bits. Here, I'm just going to set up a region of interest. I'm going to feed Oceania into the world that I get from GeoPandas and read that database of shapefiles and convert them into stare. And now I have a bunch of stare representations of these different countries, landmasses, if you will. And I can use this to construct a region of interest. So Stare Pandas was developed by my colleague from the University of California, Santa Barbara, Nicholas Griesbaum, to make all of this very easy and familiar to those folks who are familiar with data frames, X-arrays, and that sort of thing. So you can use Stare Pandas to actually work with these data. And we're going to use Stare Pandas in this particular notebook as a catalog. So we're going to actually construct a catalog. So you don't have to know the bits, and you can just go ahead and grab the numbers from a database or data frame-like environment. I'm told that with conventional ways to deal with subsetting and intersection in Earth science, that dealing with gaps and multiply connected regions like this, like dealing with the strait between Australia and Tasmania here, gives people in the Earth science subsetting world headaches. But here, it just falls out naturally. This is one set of this is one set of numbers, this is another set of numbers, although the numbers have a spatial semantics. Now we're getting to the catalog. I have one of these MODIS swaths going down, a number of granules associated with that. I just run a Stare Pandas folder to catalog. It goes out and reads in the stare covers associated with each of the granules that we're storing in that folder. And so now this is actually printing out what's in that Stare Pandas data frame. We want to search the catalog. So just like we did Oceania before, now we're going to do Australia. We figure out the stair index values associated with Australia. This is a NumPy array or NumPy array. We can go to the catalog and run an intersection of what's in the catalog against our region of interest there. And again, these are just NumPy int64 arrays. And the catalog tells me that, yes, I have 2 overlapping items in my catalog, and here they are. Now, because at this point, there's a bunch of data over here that is not in my region of interest, so I need to do a step to trim or subdivide some of these triangles. And because each one of these is associated with a number, and I have that quad tree built into that numbering system, I can just look at the bit patterns of those numbers and tell you what needs to be trimmed and what needs to be subdivided. And that gets me this very rapidly. And notice this straight just disappears, it falls away. Now, I have to keep translation tables that go from the stair indexing back into the native array format. And I keep those in sidecar files, which you don't really need to know about. So what's happening here is that, oh, by the way, the data files that we're working with, they're actually stored on the cloud as well. And so we have a cloud-based system, the notebook that I'm working with, talking to cloud-based storage assets over here. And all of that is part of stair pandas. So here is a data object, which is just driven by the data that's actually in the granule, not really stair related, but this gives me a place to put the arrays and also helps me figure out how to handle the mapping between the native indexing and the stair indexing, which again is stored in the sidecar files, which sit right next to the legacy data format, or granules. And here's the name of the sidecar file, and I store some information from that. Because I really don't want to calculate the latitudes and longitudes again, I just store them here because that helps with using the visualizations that people have. And here's something to actually store the subsetting. I load the data into the data objects. I match it up against for the ones that we found by asking the catalog. Form the intersection, and really the intersection is just mapping the stair indices through the translation tables back to the native indices, and here's what I get. So here I've actually used stair to reach back into legacy granules and select and down selected subset it into the system. And if you recall, if I'm dealing with thousands of data points and thousands of granules, then each one of these triangles here can have its own chunking. So I can get back to that. You move on, bring back the catalog, take it to a full day's worth of MODIS granules, and see what shows up in my region of interest. And again, each one, the stair index, a stair cover for each of these granules is just a set of numbers. And my set of numbers, the region of interest for Australia over here. So I can just compare those stair indices, figure out what needs to be discarded and what needs to be trimmed. And then I use my translation tables to go back to the original data. And there is 14 granules mapped onto Australia.
So
now,
are these all linear scanning of the data of the stair index, or are you actually using the parallelization that you mentioned earlier?
This particular exercise right here does not use parallelization. This is just a scalar computation.
Are you basically doing bitmap behind the scenes?
Hang on, please repeat. Am I basically doing what?
Bitmap manipulation behind the scenes.
It's a bit more than but by bitmap, are you referring to the old graphics idea where you would
No, actually, we should talk after this. We kind of developed something similar to this for tracking availability of nodes on a supercomputer.
Ah,
So, yeah.
okay. So I'm not familiar with that particular application, but there may be some interesting things to compare with that. So here we've harmonized the data from those different 14 granules. And this is a scatter plot and each one of these little dots is actually an observation from the different granules.
Mike, I'm still trying to understand. So you've created the stair index. The stair
Right.
index, you definitely go hierarchically, right? Or do you linearly just scan all the stair index values? Like, it's an index, it is a hierarchical index. Do you go scanning for data modules hierarchically, or do you
For this particular problem, it isn't really large enough to require using the tree, and the use of the tree is actually built into the index values themselves. And so I can just look at the index values, and the tree is already built into the numbers. And so I can just look at the numbers, and that tells me where I am in the tree, and I can tell you what the intersections is just by doing an integer operation there.
Mm-hmm.
Now I can also use that with some more. I have to say I'm not familiar with what Stair Pandas is doing, but here, let me show you one particular thing if I can. In the intersection here, if you take a look at this, when I'm doing the subsetting, this intersects over here is actually can do some of what you're talking about, where you have a where you can actually keep, say, a structure. If you remember the old HTML where you have skip lists,
Mm-hmm.
you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
You can actually store these covers in skip lists and then compare the integers in one index. In fact, you can compare the integers in this target cover with the integers over that are actually associated with the data. And so you can actually, for this particular system, because with the method 1 over here, that method 1 actually sorts the integers that are in the target cover. It sorts those stair index values there. And then what happens is that it goes through the indices of the data points back in the granules. It goes through those stair indices. It finds the closest stair. It finds the closest granule stair data point index back in your target cover. And once it finds the closest one, it either finds a direct match, in which case it's included, or it does that special bit-by-bit comparison that I was talking about. It's not really bit-by-bit comparison, but it's close enough. You actually compare the bits to see whether the granule index value is contained, whether the data triangle is connected in the target triangle, or vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
So
go ahead.
You're doing bitwise operations.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
You can.
Okay.
So it really comes down to comparing these two numbers. And the numbers have interpretations as triangles. And as long as I don't have to do a translation between integers and latitude, longitude, or physical vectors, then I don't have to pay a lot of numerical costs for that. So here I've harmonized different granules from the same data set and did a search on a region of interest. I can go back to that MERA2 gridded data. Here's the gridded data down selected in exactly the same way that I selected the MODIS data. And then I can actually deal with the MODIS data, the swath data, and the gridded data in exactly the same manner. So it's a uniform way to work with both kinds of data. Now, one thing that we can get back, we can start talking about chunking. Okay, so if I want to, I can use these, I think these are level 6 triangles over here. So they're 100 some kilometers across. And so now I can actually collect the data that falls into one of these triangles into a harmonized or integrated data product. And so just to show that that once you have integers that have spatial semantics, you can turn ordinary data structures into something really special. And so for this, I'm just going to use a Python dictionary. And for the keys of the Python dictionary, I'm going to use stair indices. So I have data entry. This is going to be what I'm going to be putting into the Python dictionary. Here's my Python dictionary with the data, which is just going to be a dictionary. And you notice that in each of the dictionary entries, I have something for Mera and I have something for MODIS. And I just go over the data. I did the Mera 2 first. I go through the data and then just let's see, I put it right here. I just pop it into the dictionary. So here I have the harmonized data. Here's the stair index value associated with a particular triangle over here. And here's where I'm actually adding the data from the original data set. And it's all done by mapping my spatial index value to the native index. So this is what I did with the Mera 2, the gridded data. And you can do the same thing with the swath data. And the difference between this picture and what you saw before is that now each one of these triangles is associated with a Python dictionary entry. And so now I can use this as a key value store. I just go to a particular key and pull it back out. And I can do that with Brisbane. So I do Brisbane, calculate the index value, and then I can go in and just pull it right out of the Python dictionary like that. So, and I can, if I want to, if I'm interested in a region around Brisbane, I've actually constructed a region of interest which is circular around Brisbane, and calculate that out. That was running on the cloud, and there you have a circle around Brisbane and the stair indices associated with that. And you can see the gridded data on a regular grid, and then you have the swath data irregularly positioned on the data set. And once you have this sort of partitioning or sharding, you can actually spread this across Dask, and then you can run it on a Dask cluster in the cloud or wherever you happen to have it, and get some parallel speed up. So that's what we've harmonized data, and we can parallelize data, scaling to both variety and volume. And so the end user doesn't have to write a lot of code in order to do this sort of selection, catalog searches, and subsetting. And I think that this will really help people be able to make more use of the low-level data, the non-gridded data that is currently very hard to use.
Okay.
So that concludes my remarks. Happy to take any questions or have any other discussion you'd like, Nanu.
Yeah, sure. I'll open up for questions to students. Yeah.
Do you happen to have an example, just data frame that you could print out or that is printed out just to show kind of the raw output?
If you take a look on this Jupyter notebook, if we go back up here to where we're dealing with the data frames, this is actually the head of the catalog data frame. And so you see the different item numbers over here and the different columns that are associated with that data frame. I'm personally not so familiar with the data frame approach myself. That's really something that Nicholas Griesbaum of Santa Barbara has really brought to the project, and very happy that he did. so, this is some of the basic stuff that you have in there. And in the data frames, you can actually have some interesting objects in there. This is just a string, and you can see that the S3 tells you that this is located out on the Amazon cloud somewhere. And over here is a stair cover, which is, again, it's just a bunch of numbers that have interpretations as triangles. So that's the data frame.
Do you actually when you say that you do parallelization of it, do you choose how you would distribute? Like in some of the slides you had shown that these you had dark triangles and light gray triangles and less light gray triangles, and it seemed like
Right.
that you are just distributing them on a round robin fashion,
Or in a random fashion, right?
in a random fashion. Okay. So
And,
so this is sort of useful for analysis which are at the scale of the sort of global analysis, I would say. But if the analysis is local, then how do you sort of take care of, like, if there's a lot of data in a given specific region, but
Right.
very less sparse data in the remainder of the region, how do you take care of that?
well, if we take a look at Brisbane, for example, the data sets that I'm using here are not extremely large. The data that I'm displaying here is the 5-kilometer data. And this one is 50-kilometer data. So there's actually not a lot of it. And this is mainly for us to get our feet on the cloud-based system. But you can easily get into 1-kilometer data and 250-meter data where you have 10,000 times more data that you're working with here. Mm-hmm. And so what you can do in that sort of case for a more local problem, for the parallelization, you can actually do your distribution on a particular grid size. For example, I chose a particular scale for this particular set of triangles for my region of interest. So when I set up my Python dictionary and I harmonized the data into that, I made a choice about how big these triangles were going to be. And I can choose that size to better fit the resources that I have for a particular computation. And that can go all the way down to the instrument field of view, the footprint of an individual measurement on the planet. So when nothing's really a pixel. It's really, some sort of oblong shape on the ground that you have. You can actually go all the way down to that level with the stair encoding. And you would, if I had much more data to work with, when I do my harmonization and load my parallel resources, I would just choose a finer scale and then partition and distribute the data according to that. The randomized part, as you probably already realize, is that I don't want hotspots developing. So for example, if Brisbane is the example over here, I might have a lot of observations down in the center of Brisbane. I might have a lot of interest in what's going on in Brisbane and a lot of observations there, and maybe not so much out there. So I want to be able to spread the computational capability across the entire region. So I want to actually cut up Brisbane and spread it out across my computing resources. And this is the same thing that SciDB does under the hood, and many other parallel computing and storage schemes do as well.
Thank you. Okay, other questions?
Why triangles?
Why?
Triangles.
Oh, why triangles?
Yeah.
Triangles tessellate the surface very nicely. And that goes back to That goes back to the reason it was chosen when this particular scheme was first used to index the solid angle to index astronomical objects. Triangles are easy to work with, and the underlying calculations, the cross products and things of that nature that actually go into calculating where these things are, have very nice properties. If you wanted to, you could use other sorts of root polyhedra, if you will, that could have a mix of different kinds of shapes, but the triangle helps keep things simple and helps keep the variations in code cases that we need to handle down.
Gotcha.
Now, one thing that I can note here is that these triangles that we have here, they're not uniform, they're not the same area. So if you want to do quantitative analysis, you have to be somewhat careful because there are the street global grid systems that are popular these days, and what they like to have is like they advocate having the same size tessellation elements, and we don't have that. We're mostly interested in indexing, helping you to find the data. And if you really want to use these triangles, well, there's a way you can calculate the area from them or cache the areas and use that to weight whatever sorts of numerical analyses you'd like to do.
Right. I think, I mean, the basic, if I understand, Mike, the basic reason is the Earth is a round ball with flattened tops, right? And if you try to tessellate that in very fine granules, you would get you would approximate the Earth not as a circle. We can't approximate it as a circle, but the closest you would approximate it as a polyhedron. And then the smallest granule of that polyhedron would be a triangle.
That's yeah. The triangle is the actually we have two square pyramids put together as our root polyhedron. And you're right. If you actually used a tetrahedron, you could actually start out this sort of thing. But then the variations in the sizes would be different. But everything else would pretty much work the same. And that's the nice thing about the code that you worked with, is that it's actually very, very general in that sort of situation. It doesn't take a lot to change the root polyhedron out. Mm-hmm. But working with the triangles helps to provide a certain similarity throughout the code, and reduces the number of cases that we have to handle in there.
Right.
So some of it is pragmatic reasoning. But you raise a different interesting point there. The latitude longitude representation that we work with were nominally WGS 84. If you know about geolocations. And with regard to the altitude away from the Earth or deviations from that geoid, that's something that we would like to go to in the future, because the Earth science deals with more than just the surface of the sphere. We actually have to deal with altitude and other things of that nature. And we would really like to add a third dimension to the spatial component of the indexing that we have. And that'll probably just be another integer that we add to our indexing schemes.
Okay. Other questions?
So the code is available on GitHub. I already shared the link to that. It does require some installation. So if you have trouble with that part, then go ahead and contact us or raise an issue in the issues part of the GitHub. We're still under development. We're not ready for production or mission critical use, but we are able to provide some rather interesting ways to interact with data.
Yeah, there's a question on that. Like, what would it take to be mission critical? Is it just a matter of optimization, or do you think there's some fundamental things that would need to change?
Well, there are different levels of mission critical there. So we still have the occasional segmentation fault that we don't understand. they're getting rarer and rarer. I haven't seen one for a few months. But some of the code that we're using is Tanu at 25 years maybe, 20 years, 15, 20 years.
Easily.
So there are some things in the code that if I had more time and money, I would replace and do over. But we have a very nicely usable system, and it's perfectly good for doing the earth science research. Now, if you wanted to start doing something that needed to be real-time mission critical to keep an astronaut alive or something like that, if depending upon what the problem is, if you're just doing integer operations on the stair indices, no problem. It's good to go right now. But when you start to get into some of the cataloging aspects, and I mentioned these skipped list ranges, which actually allow you to keep track of large numbers and large complex regions on the planet, going back and forth between the latitude and longitude and stair sometimes touches parts of the code which haven't been used in a while.
So on a related topic, I think you said that you didn't get another round of funding. Does NASA still have an interest, or?
NASA is very interested in this because we're moving a lot of data to the cloud, and we have different kinds of low-level data. So they're still interested in this sort of scheme, and right now we're involved in infusion efforts to take this technology and put it into the data archives, so that the data archives will be able to use this in the background to help serve and improve the ability to subset data for the end users. Now what the comments were on our last effort was essentially that people aren't using STAIR yet. And so that was the main comment against going forward with the second round of funding, which is a little odd because it was, from our point of view, they were asking for more infrastructure, back end type work.
Well, yeah, and it's like a chicken and the egg problem.
It's essentially. So what I think the panel reviewers were looking for was something that was that the end user would be more interested in using. And I think that some of our recent efforts with regard to stair pandas and some of the things that I was showing you today actually shows how end users can benefit that more. But our focus has been more on the archivist to help them make new data products and help people find the data and harmonize the data so that we can have analysis ready data at scale. So that's why I'm really happy that we got to be early adopters on the NASA cloud.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mike.
No, you're welcome.
Yeah, this was fantastic. And I hope we all sort of learned about how, sort of real science is done. This gives us a taste of how real science is done.
Oh, okay. So I hope it's useful. It's a very rich field, and we have to deal with a lot of different complexities.
Right. Thanks,
Yep.
Tim. Okay, then.
My email is mike@riley.net. We're easy to find on GitHub. Just search for STAIR. And if you have any questions or want to give it a try and run into any issues, just go ahead and let me know.
Sure.
Be happy to continue.
Sure. Mike, if you don't mind, can I just talk to you for a couple of minutes?
Very good.
This? Yeah. So students can leave. Hey, Mike, thanks so much for presenting this.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah, this, I think students liked it, and it was a very good, nice perspective of an end-to-end, basically an end-to-end workflow, how exactly it works. I looked at this notebook, and this notebook looks pretty interesting. I
Thank you.
don't think, yeah, I had seen that before. So are we meeting today?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I've done a lot of work because the SIG Spatial people wanted the presentations videos turned in, 2 days ago, and I just turned it in this morning.
I see. So actually, I saw these notebooks that you have been creating, and now how long does it take for you to sort of run these notebooks?
They're not all that long. Not for this particular level here.
But I believe they can be created depending upon the data. They can be pretty computationally intensive.
They can be rather computationally intensive. For example, the stair sidecar files that I was talking about, they contain the translation tables, and you calculate a stair index for each data point in there. For something that's for the relatively small 5-kilometer data that we have over here, it takes 20 or 30 seconds, operating on a few processors, 5-6 processors to construct that file. And so it makes sense for us to construct that sidecar file so that we can touch that and load it, caching.
Right.
Because you don't really want to do that on the fly.
Right. And that part, I'm wondering, can you think of that in this notebook? There are variations that are happening, user who wants to play with this demo wants to change certain aspects of this notebook.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah.
Would versioning be required as part of these notebooks? I think that's what I'm sort of asking. That hey, today you have processed trick cells in this given way, or today you are doing I don't know, Mera 2, and tomorrow maybe you want to change this function, change a cell, and say that, well, I want to do it in some other way.
Correct. Yeah, there are a number of different ways to do that. As you see, this one is, my first time through this end to end.
Right.
But the easy way to do that would be to actually fork the repository, or you could clone this, or just download this particular file, and then work on that.
Right. No, actually, I should